Are Republicans losing confidence in democracy, by which I mean in constitutional democracy? According to an op-ed by Catherine Rampell in the Washington Post, we are. Her article is titled, "Republicans Are Sprinting Away from Democracy." And she goes on to say that there have been all these surveys of Republicans. And she says, the most troubling results came from a question about the party's best strategy for winning in the future in 2022 and 2024. People were asked, should the Republican Party focus on developing a message and popular policies and ideas, or should they focus on prioritizing changes to the voting rules in various states and districts? And about half of Republicans said the latter. And Catherine Rampell jumps on this and goes, in other words, nearly half of those who still identify as Republicans appear to have given up on a key premise of democracy, that you earn the right to govern by proposing ideas that appeal to a majority of the public. Instead, she says, they prefer to short-circuit that process by making it harder for opponents to vote. Now, this is a very serious charge, and of course, Catherine Rampell is far from being the only one to make it. This notion that the Republicans are against democracy resonates with the whole critique of January 6th, and it's part of this larger idea that the Democrats are the only ones standing up for democracy, and the Republicans are against democracy. So I want to meet the charge head on. First of all, why is it the case that half of Republicans think that, quite apart from making a more popular agenda and appealing to the public, the country needs to fix its voting processes? Well, the reason that half of Republicans think that is that half of Republicans believe that the Democrats the last time around didn't focus on the campaign. They focused on controlling the processes of the election itself. They focused on the mail-in ballots and all this litigation of forcing districts to mail these ballots out en masse. They maintained full control of the vote counting machines. They stopped the count when the vote didn't seem to be going their way, resumed the count when they were ready. They blocked people from having close observation of what was going on. You couldn't really see what was happening with the ballots. So the Democrats maintained a kind of close control of the voting process. Meanwhile, what were Republicans doing? Having rallies, campaigning, making their case to the American people. So a lot of Republicans go, wait a minute, maybe we had the wrong focus. Maybe while we were focusing on selling our ideas, the other guys were focused on controlling the process of the count. So we need to fix the process to make sure that it's fair. We need to fix the process to make sure that legitimate votes are being counted, and only legitimate votes. Now, more broadly, if you object to a process that you think is fatally flawed, it's kind of like saying, I'm a cyclist and I object to cyclists who are doping while participating in races. People can say, well, you're against cycling. You're against the very cycling process. No, I'm not against the cycling process, but in order to have a fair race, we got to make sure that all the competitors are legit. And that's what's going on here with the voting process. We're trying to make sure that the voters who vote are legit. The second point I want to make is that constitutional democracy is not democracy pure and simple. It's not democracy that simply says the majority rules, the majority has its way in everything. By the way, when the British rebelled against their kings, they replaced the authority of the king with the authority of the people, believing that in doing so, they had solved the problem of tyranny. Why? Because it's no longer one man who's in charge, it's now the many who are in charge. Part of the genius of the American founders was to realize that you could have tyranny either way. You can have the tyranny of the one, or you can have what the founders called the tyranny of the majority, the tyranny of the many. The people can be just as despotic as a monarch. Here's a quote from Jefferson: an elective despotism is not what we fought for. For Jefferson, you can have a despotism established by an elected majority. And the reason our constitutional system has all these checks and balances, all these efforts to, you may say, prevent one team from gaining absolute power, even a majority, The reason we have individual rights that are named in the Bill of Rights as protected from majorities, the reason we have courts whose job it is to protect those individual rights against legislatures, which is to say, quoting Joseph Story now, the great jurist, against the people themselves. The reason we have all this is because the American founders realized that power has to be dispersed to avoid the risk of tyranny. Minority rights are just as legitimate as majority rights. The majority does have the right to rule, but within certain enumerated and confined parameters. The bottom line of it is, I don't think Catherine Rampell has any sense of this. To her, any efforts to identify legitimate voters is proving to be an attack on democracy. Basically, the more people who vote, the better, and never mind who exactly is doing the voting, and never mind that there's no careful scrutiny to make sure that the people participating in the race, the cyclists, by my analogy, there's no effort to make sure that these cyclists are appearing at the race without having taken all kinds of drugs, without ultimately having rigged the system in their behalf. And any efforts to reform the cycling race, any efforts to make sure the competitors are all legitimate, is somehow seen as an attack on the process, an attack on cycling. These people have lost faith in cycling itself. No, we haven't. We believe in cycling, we believe in democracy, but we believe in constitutional democracy, and we will continue, regardless of all these preposterous accusations, to make sure that this democracy works the way the founders set it up to work.